Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Shestokas.
A few days ago, as I was preparing to come here and get ready to do a number of things, one of the things I did, my wife told me that I needed to do this, was to go get a haircut. And she gave me specific directions on what to do, and how it should just get a trim, only take it off here, do this and that. And of course, I did the best I could to convey this to the woman that was cutting my hair, because I wanted to make sure that it looked the way it was supposed to when I got home. And because I'd been so specific about the directions, the woman cutting my hair asked me, she said, "Do you have something special going on?" I said, "Yeah, in a couple of days I'm going down to Southwest Florida and talk about the Constitution for Constitution Day." And she said, "Wow, that's really, really wonderful." And then she said, "It's too bad that most of our leaders and most of the people that we put in charge or in power pay no attention to the Constitution anymore." And I hesitated and thought for a second. And then I asked her, I said, "Whose fault is that?" And she hesitated and sheepishly and softly said, "Ours." It's not the fault of our leaders, it's our fault, because they've given us all the tools we need to take charge and do what we need to do to have our Constitution work for us. We're going to talk about today a little bit about the founding documents, particularly the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and maybe we're going to look at them in a way that perhaps you've never thought about. But maybe when we get done, you'll see that actually they're pretty straightforward kinds of documents. The heritage that I was speaking of is found in the Constitution, protections for the unalienable rights that are outlined in the Declaration of Independence. There's something else, though. The unalienable rights and the protections that are in the Constitution that are written there. There's protections for speech, and there's protections for religion, there's protections for the press. Fact is that you'll find those same protections written in all three versions of the constitutions of the former Soviet Union. And you'll see all those rights written into the same multiple versions that they've gone through over the years of the People's Republic of China. So without us understanding what it was and demanding that our government follow the words that we were so blessed to be handed down to us, they are just paper. It's often noted that 22 of the 40 signers of the Constitution were attorneys. It's also noted that 35 of the 50 signers of the Declaration of Independence were attorneys. It's not often noted what the implications are of those statistics. And the implications of those statistics are there was a commonality of understanding of language that people shared, that the people in those rooms that put these things together shared. And sometimes, not all the stuff that you find written in the words explain the documents, because they had common understandings in the documents. The documents were put together principally, by two lawyers. One very well known, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, in fact, wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was the author, he drafted it, it got worked over by the Continental Congress, and it didn't come out quite exactly the way he wrote it in the first place, but he was the author and drafted it. He became a lawyer at 24. He wrote the Declaration of Independence when he was 33 years old. The second guy that we're going to talk about a little bit today is a fellow that's much less well known, although he wrote the most famous phrase in all of American history. His name's Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris, or Gouverneur, if it's properly pronounced in the 18th century sense. And governor was not his title, that was his actual name. That was the name he was actually given, was governor. Graduated King's College when he was 16 years old, which became Columbia University. And then he was admitted to practice law when he was 19. And as we're going to find out, he ultimately found out that he was he ultimately wound up being the principal writer of the Constitution, despite the fact that everything else happened. I consider these two guys. And Don was nice enough to say a lot of nice things about me. But of course, Jefferson wrote the Declaration of 33, and Morris wrote the Constitution of 35. And despite all those nice things, I only got sworn in as a lawyer when I was 35. I feel like a bit of an underachiever when I talk about these guys. On the other hand, perhaps a redeeming quality is that before I was a lawyer, for most of my life I sold beer. In fact, I delivered my first case of beer when I was 5 years old. And I learned how to drive a beer truck before I learned how to drive a car. So even at this point, I was in the beer business longer than I've been a lawyer. And at heart, I'm kind of still a beer guy. You know, I still feel a little more comfortable with that. Now, there is a way to connect the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and beer. Somebody, I met a gentleman here earlier that apparently is from Philadelphia, and I told him we were going to talk a little bit about City Tavern today. City Tavern is a place in Philadelphia that actually was in business, started in 1773 and is still in business today, where the delegates from the Continental Congress that went to, that ultimately issued the Declaration of Independence, and the delegates to the Constitutional Convention that wrote the Constitution. Used to get together, and a lot of business they did over beer. They used to talk about things, having a sip of beer. And certainly, I would think, although some of you as freshmen may not have had this experience yet, but it's City Tavern, though they would talk about the issues of the day. Certainly, it's not unusual that they have quizzes and have trivia contests between and among them. And I think everybody has a little blue piece of paper or a little something there. And if you have something to write with, I'm going to ask you a question. But here's the question. Name the 5 rights that are in the First Amendment. Today's Constitution Day. And I don't know if everybody necessarily considers really how important a day it is. But Constitution Day, September 17th, 1787, the world changed. On September 16th, 1787, the world was dominated by kings and czars and sultans and chiefs and other kinds of despots. There, in fact, had never been any kind of self-governing people in reality anywhere in the 5,000 or 10,000 years of world history. There was a small period, a small exercise at times by the Greeks, and maybe a short period of pre-imperial Rome. But for the most part, there were no self-governing people and had never been anything like that in the world. September 17th, and 1787, and the following year, where the proposed Constitution was debated in taverns, in churches, in schools, in stores, on farms, everywhere across the country, consisted of the single largest participation in the organization of government in the history of the world. And if you think about the year that started and the ratification process, it probably is the most significant secular event in the history of mankind. Because that was the status of the world on September 16, 1787. There were no free people. Today, 2015, there's 192 countries in the world. Of those 192 countries in the world, 123 of them, their population participates in a significant and meaningful way in their self-government. That's how important September 17th is. And it's something that often gets overlooked, and it's the huge change that took place in the world. It was really the year that free speech blossomed in America because of the debates across the continent. You know, it had Declaration of Independence, and we're going to talk about a lot of great things that happened as a result of that. Fact is, though, regarding the Declaration of Independence and the people, you could pretty much accept it, or you could leave, or you could shut up. There were 30,000 British troops on the way. Okay, they didn't have a chance to sit around and say, well, what do you think? Should we do this or should we do that? 30,000 British troops on the way. The free speech blossomed in the year 87, 88. And what was different about the time then was that the fact that people could oppose the Constitution and not be demonized. The Constitution had its proponents in James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, and Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, the famous guys issuing the Federalist Papers. On the other hand, some of the more famous revolutionaries, Patrick, give me liberty or give me death, Henry, was opposed to the Constitution. Richard Henry Lee, who had proposed independence, was opposed to the Constitution. George Mason, the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, was opposed to the Constitution. They had a raucous and open debate and lived by the results of the vote. Something like that had never happened in the history of the world before. People could do that and not be demonized. One of the interesting things that they also did during that ratification process was, it was generally speaking necessary for people to own property to be qualified to vote in the colonies or in the early states after '76. But they waived the property requirement so that they could make as many people eligible to participate in the ratification process of the Constitution. That was the beginning of the expansion of the electorate in the United States, was when they actually proposed the Constitution. It's key to James Madison, the Heritage Institute, and a lot of people walk around with pride, they carry a copy of the Constitution. And it's certainly one thing to have a copy of the Constitution and a copy of the documents and be familiar with those. It's also a completely other thing to study them and understand the meaning that's behind them and underneath them. And there's two keys to that. One is the fact that there's 18th century language. As everybody knows, language kind of changes over time. Things that, it may even change faster these days than it did then. But the Constitution has a great example, and that is that in the preamble, how weird does it sound in the 21st century ear to say, more perfect union? It's kind of bizarre, right? It's kind of strange. When we think of something that's perfect, we think of something that's without fault, that can't be improved on, it's as complete as it could possibly be. Well, in the 18th century, perfect didn't mean what it means today. It came from a Latin term, perfecere, and the Latin term meant to complete. In which case, when Governor Morris wrote more perfect union, what he was referring to was improving upon the imperfect union that was organized under the Articles of Confederation, which was the precursor to the Constitution. So when he's talking about more perfect union there, if you understand perfect in the 18th century sense, then the term more perfect makes perfect sense. But if you understand it in the 21st century sense, it doesn't make sense at all. And so it's language is one of the things that we battle when we try to understand what's going on with these documents. And there's plenty of people that wrote plenty of stuff about that. But we talked about the two orders before, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about waters now. I'll get back to your stories and lighten it up a little bit. But I'll tell you about lawyers at the moment. Lawyers do things, good lawyers imitate and improvise. They don't really ever reinvent the wheel. They see what was done before, and then they kind of plug things in and try and repeat that. And basically, we have a form for everything. We have a form for a deed, we have a form for a will, we have a form for a real estate contract. And there are forms that lawyers rely upon. And so there's another way to look at what these documents mean, and understanding that they were in fact written by lawyers reveals that there's things in the documents that aren't necessarily, as Jefferson might say, self-evident. A close look at the Declaration of Independence tells you that it looks like another document. It looks like, pretty much, Thomas Jefferson pulled out his form book and filled in some blanks. It very well might have been called, instead of the Declaration of Independence, it might have been called the United States of America versus King George. He pulled out his form book that said a legal complaint. Legal complaints generally start with a whereas statement. Jefferson didn't start the Declaration of Independence with whereas, primarily because whereas is something pretty much the king says in a royal decree. And they were declaring a revolution. They were getting rid of the king, so he didn't want to start out with whereas, in which case he came up with the when in the course of human events. The next element of a legal complaint, generally speaking, has a statement of law, the law that applies to the complaint. Jefferson starts with his self-evident truths. His self-evident truths include our natural rights, the law of nature, and nature's God. He then moves on to the unalienable rights. He talks about the purpose of government to fulfill, to allow people to pursue their natural rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and then to do that with the consent of the government. That's the law that Jefferson set up under this circumstance. When you got a legal complaint, and I hope, probably at your age, I hope many people have never seen one yet. Maybe if you're blessed in your life, you'll never see one. But if you ever do, when you lay the Declaration of Independence side by side with it, they're the same thing. Because they put down what the king did wrong, they put down what the colonists did right. They put down that we most humbly petitioned the government, you know, and he painted his plaintiffs in a very nice light. He applied the law to the facts. When he applied the law to the facts, there was only one single remedy. What would be that remedy? Oh, come on, it's up there. What's the only remedy left? And that's how he built the Declaration of Independence, by taking a legal complaint and plugging in the facts that he wanted to. That's how lawyers work. That's how he was. And Governor Morris, his writings entitled "To Secure the Blessings of Liberty" turned out to be the guy. They appointed out on September 8th, 1787, they appointed a committee of five guys. And what that committee got, the Committee on Style and Arrangement got, was 23 different articles with clips and pieces of paper for different amendments, and they were all kind of like in a big file. They were kind of in a big mess. The guys had, over the last 4 or 5 months, had agreed basically on what they were going to do, but it wasn't organized in any way, shape, or form. And over the next 4 days, even though like Jefferson, there had been 5 guys on the Declaration Committee, and there was 5 guys on the Committee of Style and Arrangement to put together the Constitution, like Jefferson, they wound up giving it to one guy. They wound up giving it to Governor Morris. Governor Morris took those 23 different articles and those and multiple amendments and organized them into the Constitution. And how did he do that in 4 days? Well, He pulled out his form book. He pulled out his form book, and he turned the form book to the page called Power of Attorney. Now, everybody here probably has had some sort of interaction with the power of attorney. Perhaps mostly used power of attorney used these days is probably one for healthcare. All right? And power of attorney, generally speaking, would have a variety of elements as well. Parties are identified. If you have a party of healthcare for power of attorney for healthcare, the person that's looking for the powers is, I, so-and-so, appoint this person to take care of, look after my health needs. Morris identified the parties. He said, principal, we the people were the principal of this power of attorney that he created. The agent, the United States. The authority was granted to the agent, and the authority granted in the Constitution included primarily Article 1, Section 8, which is what we call enumerated powers. And there's an understanding why that's enumerated powers, and the understanding of why those are enumerated and limited powers runs from the structure of the document. You don't find that written. Nobody says that this is written, these are limited here. It's found in the document because of the structure. There's limits on the agent's authority that they get placed through the power of attorney. There's also provisions in a power of attorney. If you have one for healthcare, then there's a provision where somebody can scratch it out and appoint somebody else. Or you can do that way, or you can alter it. The limitations say that you can only do certain things. And the situation with the revoking of the agency, there's an Article 5. The Article 5 describes the amendment process and how you change the Constitution through Article 5. And strangely enough, there's provisions for what they call appointment of successor agents, and amendments 9 and 10 deal with the reserved powers of the state and successor agents to the federal government and the powers that weren't given to the federal government. Now, the implications for the Constitution and the choice of this document were really important, because a power of attorney allows one person to act on behalf of another based upon specific instructions. Now, the 22 folks that were there that were attorneys understood that when you have a power of attorney, the agent has a duty to follow directly the instructions of the principal. The agent has a duty to take care faithfully of the principal's business. The agent has a duty, strangely enough, not to engage in any business activities that they may have learned while they're being the agent. These restrictions are all built into that document. And so when they got together and they put out the Constitution in a power of attorney shape, all the people that put it together understood that even though these things weren't written in the document, they were all elements of the document. They were all parts of the limitations on the exercise of authority of the federal government. And that's where when people talk about enumerated powers and limited government, it's not actually written in the Constitution. It's the understanding from the structure of the Constitution. And the other thing about that is though only 22 were lawyers. The other 18, they're all businessmen, they're all involved in business. And in the 18th century, of course, if you left for business, they couldn't tax and say, pay this bill, they couldn't do this and do that. They always would leave town with powers of attorney, given the people that ran their businesses the authority to do exactly what they told them to do. And that's what everybody understood in the 18th century about the Constitution that we seem to have lost today because we don't have that common understanding of the unwritten parts of the document that was understood by everybody in the that vote was involved in putting together the Constitution. Ultimately, dating well back to before the Revolution, there were rules, legal rules for interpreting documents, including powers of attorney, which ultimately the Constitution is. If you take a healthcare power and you set it beside the Constitution, you look at the form. Same thing. Comes out of the form book. And so the Constitution of the United States really needs to be viewed through what we call a fiduciary lens, that the government is our fiduciary. The government has to follow those rules to pay attention to our needs, pay attention to our instructions, and not operate outside our instructions. And so when we talk about those things, those are what we need to do. Regarding what we should expect of our government, if you execute a power of attorney and you have somebody for health care, which is the most common that people use these days, you don't expect that the person you appoint to operate outside that power. If you tell them you only want certain kinds of medication ahead of time, you tell them you only want certain kinds of treatment ahead of time, you tell them, no, I don't want this done, you expect that they will follow that exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, because the Constitution is in fact a power of attorney, we must expect no less from our government than to follow the rules that we set forth in the Constitution. So the format and the structure were just as important as the language, and it's often overlooked, and it's something that on Constitution Day, I think people should reflect upon, that you got to do more than carry a Constitution in your pocket. You got to do more than be able to quote Article 1, Section 8, and say these are the enumerated powers, and say that Article 2 defines the office of the President. And you got to do more than what you find out in Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes law. Yeah, no, really, seriously. That's good, I'm fine. That was probably the beer guy coming out. But you need to find out more than what's in Schoolhouse Rock. And it's not that difficult if you understand this concept. This concept is actually a pretty straightforward concept. And everything else kind of flows from that. A final word about Governor Morris. Yeah, anybody, and I ask you to be honest, who actually has heard of Governor Morris before today? Well, less than half, right? Well, less than half. When he was on the committee of style and arrangement, they gave him all these powers. There was 23 different drafts of these articles here and these amendments here. They gave him sort of a big pile and a big notebook to put them together. And he got an opening draft that was included for him of the preamble. And the opening draft of the preamble that was submitted to Governor Morris in the first place said, "We the people of the states of New Hampshire and New York and North Carolina and South Carolina and Virginia and Massachusetts and the other 6 do ordain and establish." Governor Morris, who most people don't know about and haven't heard of, changed those words to "we the people of the United States." Governor Morris is the author of the single most famous phrase in American history. He may not have had the same marketing skills as Thomas Jefferson, but he certainly had the same ability to turn a phrase. But the importance of the phrase was more important than its elegance, because we the people of New York, New Hampshire, et cetera, it was creating an organization of governments, right, that were going to be organized together. When Morris changed those words, Morris ultimately set in motion the creation of a nation of the people of the United States. And he has more due coming than he has gotten to date. Now, if we've collected any of those, go ahead and bring them up. I'll flip through the first 6 and we'll give away 6 prizes. The first 6 that how many think you got all 5? Wow, that's fantastic. I hope you're right, because the First Amendment Center, the most recent study in 2013, tells me that only 1 out of 1,000 Americans can name these. So if you bear with me. I'll stick around for pictures if you want. Around the turn of the century, Russia occupied a small country called Lithuania. It was very dangerous. There was rebellion all across Russia. 15-year-old girl left, went across the Atlantic Ocean all by herself, a 15-year-old Lithuanian girl. She ultimately wound up in Chicago. There was a 21-year-old Lithuanian young man who was about to be forcibly conscripted into the Russian army. He fled Lithuania and came to the United States, wound up in Chicago. They met, they married, had children, started a beer business that lasted 65 years. The young girl was my grandmother. She was born in September. She insisted we celebrate her birthday on the 4th of July, which was the anniversary of her becoming an American citizen. There is somebody like my grandmother in the history of every one of you in this room. The story about my family is not a Lithuanian story. It's not a Russian story. It's an American story. And on Constitution Day, it's important that we not only think about the James Madisons and the Alexander Hamiltons and the Thomas Jeffersons and please don't forget Governor Morris. But it's not only important to think about them, but it's important to think about the millions of people that were inspired by the work they did to come and make America what it's become today. Thank you very much.